The deputy had been on my ranch for less than 3 minutes when Marla Voss demanded that she arrest me for stealing water. That was impressive for several reasons. The first was that I had not taken any water. The second was that the water Marla claimed I had stolen was sitting exactly where it had always sat, behind a locked steel headgate on my property. The third was that Marla had arrived wearing white shoes beside an open irrigation channel, which suggested she had prepared more carefully for the accusation than for the terrain. Behind her, the entrance sprinklers at Meadow Estates made a dry clicking sound. Every few seconds, one of them coughed out a thin brown mist, reconsidered its ambitions, and stopped. "He shut off our community water," Marla told Deputy Lena Ortiz. "I want the valve reopened, and I want this documented as intentional sabotage." Lena looked at the orange maintenance barrier, the laminated closure notice, the wet concrete inside the drained flume, and the brass ditch company seal on my lock. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Rowan, did you close this gate?" "Yes." Marla raised both hands as if I had saved everyone the trouble of a trial. I pointed to the notice. "Yesterday morning, for a scheduled repair on my lateral." "His lateral feeds our property," Marla said. "He knows that." I did know an old branch crossed toward the subdivision. It had been installed when the first streets were dirt, and the developer needed water for dust control and young landscaping. What I did not know was why, nearly 20 years later, Marla was describing it as a community utility. Lena asked the question that mattered. "Are any houses without drinking water?" Marla hesitated. "That is not the point." It was, in fact, a fairly important point when someone had called 911 about a water emergency. The homes had municipal water. Faucets worked. Toilets flushed. Nobody was choosing between thirst and a decorative pear tree. The failure was limited to irrigation, entrance lawns, medians, and, according to an alarm chirping somewhere beyond the stone wall, the clubhouse pond. Marla stepped closer to the barrier. "This system has served Sage Meadow for years. He cannot simply turn it off." "If it is your system," I said, "why is its only operating control inside my ranch repair zone?" That slowed the conversation by half a second. It did not improve Marla's opinion of me. Lena told everyone to stay away from the lock while she figured out whether there was a crime, a contract dispute, or an unusually expensive landscaping problem. Marla continued using the phrase community water. I continued looking at the old branch line disappearing beneath the fence. I knew why that pipe had been installed. I did not yet know what the HOA had connected to it since. To explain how a routine 48-hour repair ended with a sheriff's vehicle beside my headgate, I have to go back 30 hours, to a wet crack in a place that should have been dry. My ranch is not the kind people put on postcards. We have 87 acres of orchard, hay ground, equipment sheds, and enough dust to make every truck look historically significant by noon. The western edge follows the number 6 lateral, a concrete irrigation channel built long before Meadow Estates acquired stone pillars, coordinated mailbox paint, and a committee for seasonal banner consistency. I worked 26 years for the Valley Irrigation-District before taking over the ranch full-time. Most of that job involved explaining that water goes where gravity, pressure, and maintenance allow it to go, which is less inspiring than the speeches people make about water, but considerably more useful. My son Eli found the seep on Monday afternoon. He was checking the lower orchard when he noticed a dark patch along the outside of the measuring flume. By the time I got there, a thin line of water had pushed through a crack and collected beneath the concrete lip. It was not a dramatic failure. Water infrastructure usually begins with something small enough to postpone and expensive enough to punish you for postponing it. We shut the orchard turnout and watched the gauge. The level dropped faster than it should have. "How long?" Eli asked. 2 days if the crack is clean. Longer if the concrete underneath is loose. The forecast showed 4 days above 98 degrees starting Thursday. Our next full orchard rotation began Friday night. If we repaired immediately, the lining could cure before the heat peaked. If we waited, we would lose water through the crack during the rotation and risk turning a narrow seep into a washed-out foundation. I called the ditch office, filed the maintenance closure, and sent Ravi Desai the photographs. Ravi had replaced me as field supervisor and had inherited both my route and my old habit of asking for one more picture than anyone thought necessary. 48 hours minimum, he said. Post both approaches. Photograph the gate setting. Seal the control after closure. I scheduled a concrete lining crew, printed notices, and walked the lateral with Eli. Near the eastern fence, the old developer branch rose through a faded green valve box. I had seen it 1,000 times. My father had allowed the connection during Sage Meadows' construction phase, when the developer needed limited raw water for dust control and establishing roadside plants. Back then, every load was supposed to pass through a temporary meter. The developer maintained the branch. Once construction ended, I assumed the connection had either been abandoned or replaced by a proper service arrangement. The HOA had changed boards so often that its institutional memory seemed to have the shelf life of yogurt, but I had no reason to inspect its utility files. That assumption was mine, and later I had to own it. Knowing where a pipe is does not mean you know what people have decided to call it. At 5 that evening, I taped closure notices to both ranch access points and emailed a copy to the ditch office. I also sent one to the general address listed on the Sage Meadow website because the branch sat near their boundary. The automated reply thanked me for contacting the community and promised a response within 10 business days, which was comforting in the way a decorative fire extinguisher is comforting. At 5:40 the next morning, I photographed the gauge, closed the head gate, watched the water drain below the repair, and attached Ravi's numbered seal to the lock. Eli climbed into the flume with a pressure washer. I started marking the damaged concrete. Across the fence, the HOA irrigation controller began its morning cycle. There was another reason the timing mattered. The lower orchard had been replanted 3 years earlier after a freeze, and those younger trees did not have the root depth of the older blocks. Eli had already shifted 2 crews to thin fruit early, so the trees carried less stress into the heat. Losing a full rotation would not kill them overnight, but it could reduce fruit size, weaken next year's buds, and turn one maintenance delay into a problem that followed us through another season. That was the difference between our water and the way people often talked about water. Ours was not an abstract asset waiting in a pipe. It was a schedule. A headgate opened at a certain hour, a measured amount crossed a flume, one block received its turn, and another waited. If somebody upstream took more than planned, the shortage appeared downstream as time. The trees did not care whether the missing hour had been caused by a leak, a paperwork error, or a board president with a confident vocabulary. Before closing the gate, I walked the repair zone one final time and dictated the conditions into my phone: upstream level, gate position, crack length, soil moisture, weather, and the numbered seal Ravi had issued. Eli teased me for narrating concrete at dawn. I told him concrete was a better listener than most committees and usually gave clearer answers. Then I closed the control. The first sign was not a phone call. It was a sprinkler beside the Sage Meadow monument, rising out of the grass, rotating once, and releasing a tired puff of water the color of weak coffee. 3 more heads followed. They clicked through their programmed arcs with admirable discipline, and no useful result. Farther down the entrance road, another zone opened and produced the same dry cough. Eli turned off the pressure washer. Is that from us? It should not be. The old construction branch had served the original entrance strip. Even if somebody had left that line active, it should not have controlled multiple zones. Then an alarm started near the clubhouse pond, a repeating electronic chirp that sounded like an appliance objecting to management. A landscaping truck arrived at 6:25. Two workers opened controller cabinets, checked valve boxes, and made calls. At 6:47, a silver SUV stopped beside our fence hard enough to throw dust over the maintenance signs. Marla Voss got out. I knew Marla by sight. She had introduced herself 6 months earlier after becoming HOA president and had explained that Sage Meadow valued visual continuity along all shared edges. I had told her our shared edge consisted mostly of wire fence and wind-blown thistle. She had written something on her clipboard, possibly the first draft of a policy against both. That morning she walked straight to the barrier. You need to reopen the water. The flume is under repair. Your shutdown disabled our irrigation system. I looked past her. Your houses still have municipal water? Of course they do. This is landscape water. Then nobody's water service is off. Your irrigation is connected to my lateral. She said it as though correcting a child. It is connected to the community supply. I asked for the current service agreement or meter account. Marla said Sage Meadow had used the water since the subdivision opened. In her view, duration was a form of paperwork that became more official every year. Nobody questioned it. I explained the developer branch. Temporary construction use, limited flow, dust suppression and plant establishment. Separate maintenance responsibility. That may have been how it started, she said, but it is permanent now. Based on what? Based on established use. That phrase can mean several things. Sometimes it means there is an agreement in a file. Sometimes it means nobody has opened the file. I told her the repair would take 48 hours, and that no one could reopen the gate while the lining was cleaned, patched, and curing. I offered Ravi's number and suggested she check the HOA's current authorization with the ditch company. Marla photographed the lock, the notice, and me. She did not photograph the ditch company phone number printed in large type at the bottom. If the landscaping is damaged, the association will hold you responsible. If the association has an active service agreement, send it to Ravi. We are not asking permission to use our own water. Then she called 911. She told the dispatcher I had intentionally cut a community water supply during extreme heat and was refusing to restore it. She did not mention that the community's drinking water worked normally. By the time 2 sheriff's vehicles turned onto my access road, the lining crew had arrived, the flume was drained, and Marla had gathered 5 residents at the fence. The repair had been ordinary for 1 hour and 7 minutes. After that, it became governance. Deputy Lena Ortiz arrived first. She was in her 40s, spoke quietly, and had the useful habit of looking at physical things before listening to people describe them. She checked the barrier, the wet repair surface, and the numbered seal. Then she asked Marla whether any resident lacked drinking water. Their indoor service is separate, Marla admitted, but the common areas are without essential irrigation. Lena wrote that down. So this is landscaping water. Marla disliked the smaller noun. She described dead lawns, damaged trees, falling property values, and my deliberate interference with infrastructure. None of the lawns were dead. At that point, they had been dry for roughly 90 minutes, a condition experienced by most lawns every night. I showed Lena the maintenance filing, Ravi's text confirming the closure, photographs of the crack, the contractor work order, and the time-stamped gate setting. I did not produce a deed or give a lecture about water law, because neither would tell her what the current branch agreement allowed. "Do you own the ditch?" she asked. "The ditch company operates the main system. I operate this measured lateral under my ranch allocation. The disputed branch comes off my lateral, and the HOA says it has a right to that branch. It had a temporary developer allowance. I have not seen a current one." Lena turned to Marla. "Do you have the agreement?" "Not with me." Do you have an account number? Marla said the HOA's landscaper handled operational details. This was the first time the landscaper had entered the legal theory. Lena called dispatch and verified there were no emergency reports from Sage Meadow. Then she called Ravi using the number on my notice. Ravi confirmed the maintenance closure and said the gate could not be disturbed without risking the repair and violating the seal. That did not decide who had a contractual right to water. Lena was careful about that. I am not ruling on ownership, allocation, easement, or whatever agreement may exist, she said. I am telling everyone that I do not have evidence of criminal sabotage, and nobody is touching this control until the operator clears it. Marla asked whether Lena understood the value of Sage Meadow's landscaping. Lena looked at the dry sprinklers. I understand why you're upset. That doesn't turn a service dispute into an arrest. One resident lowered his phone. Another asked Marla whether the HOA had a backup source. Marla said the board had never needed one because the community water had always been reliable. There was that phrase again, community water. Repetition had promoted it from assumption to title. I told the lining crew to continue. Lena photographed the lock and asked me not to alter the branch after the repair until Ravi reviewed it. I agreed. Marla wanted the entire scene entered into an incident report, so Lena entered it, including the functioning household supply, the posted notice, and the missing agreement. Before leaving, Lena gave both of us the report number. Marla held the card between two fingers. The association will pursue this through its own enforcement process. I was not a member of Sage Meadow Estates, but I had learned that a determined committee can treat geography as an administrative inconvenience. By noon, the HOA's process had located me. The first notice arrived by email at 11:43. The second was taped to my ranch gate 20 minutes later, which suggested Sage Meadow's 10-business-day response estimate applied only to people asking questions. The notice accused me of unauthorized utility interference, landscape endangerment, work near shared infrastructure, and failure to obtain architectural approval. It assessed 3 daily fines and reserved the right to charge me for plant replacement. I read it twice. The architectural approval was my favorite. The flume had been on the ranch since 1968, so if Sage Meadow wished to review its design, the committee was only 56 years behind schedule. I did not call Marla. I scanned the notice, saved the envelope from the process server, and sent one response to the board address. I stated that I was not an HOA member. The repair was on my operated lateral. The ditch company had approved the closure, and any claim of service authority should be submitted to Ravi with the current agreement and account number. Then I returned to the flume. The lining crew had found loose concrete beneath the crack. The repair would still fit the 48-hour window, but only if the surface dried properly and nobody introduced water early. Eli was coordinating our reduced orchard schedule. 2 blocks of young trees would have to wait until Friday night. At 2, a produce buyer forwarded Eli a post from the Sage Meadow resident page. It said an adjacent commercial operator had unilaterally terminated essential community water during a heat event. The wording made me sound like a foreign government with a valve. The buyer asked whether there was a dispute that might affect deliveries. That was the first consequence Marla could not dismiss as brown grass. Our orchard supplied 3 local stores. We had spent years convincing buyers that small operations could be dependable. A public claim about deliberate utility sabotage was not helpful branding. I sent the buyer the maintenance confirmation and explained that no household service or orchard production had been interrupted. He thanked me and kept the order, but the call cost an hour during a repair day. Inside Sage Meadow, the story was beginning to split. Some residents accepted Marla's version. Others asked why the HOA had no emergency irrigation plan and whether their dues included water service. Nora Bell, the treasurer, emailed Marla and copied the other directors. She asked for the water account, the governing agreement, and the budget line supporting the claim against me. Marla replied that the association's rights were established by continuous historic use and administered through the landscaping contract. Nora asked a shorter question: which account pays for the water? Nobody answered that afternoon. Nora did not let the silence settle. She pulled the last 3 annual budgets and found a water management line folded into landscape operations. The totals increased after the East Median and Pond projects, but no supporting page named a provider. When she asked the property manager for the underlying contract, he sent the landscaping agreement. When she asked where the actual water charge appeared, he referred her back to the same line item. It was a small administrative circle, perfectly smooth and entirely useless. The budget supported the invoice because the invoice had been used to build the budget. Nora also found that the reserve study treated irrigation controls as HOA equipment, but said nothing about the source. That omission mattered because the board had planned controller replacements and decorative upgrades without planning for delivery infrastructure. They had budgeted for the faucets and forgotten the pipe leading to them. She forwarded those records to Seth Coleman, the association attorney. Seth replied that historical operation might support negotiation, but the board should not issue more enforcement notices until it identified the governing instrument. Marla interpreted that as advice to locate the instrument quickly. Nora interpreted it as advice to stop escalating. Only one interpretation reduced the risk. Instead, the board held an emergency call and authorized its landscape contractor to restore service. The work order described the task as re-establishing normal community utility operations. Bureaucratic language is remarkably good at making an unverified act sound like routine maintenance. Add enough syllables, and even trespass can arrive wearing a name badge. I did not see the work order until the next morning. I saw the truck first. Vic Hale arrived at 7:15 with one employee, a valve key, and the expression of a man who had been told a problem was simple by someone not standing near the problem. The flume lining was still curing. Orange barriers blocked both approaches. Ravi's seal remained intact. Vic parked outside the ranch gate and held up the HOA work order. They want the branch reopened. It cannot be reopened yet. They say it's their control. I pointed through the fence. Their control is downstream. This headgate is mine, and that seal belongs to the ditch company. Vic read the maintenance notice. Unlike Marla, he made it to the phone number. He said his crew had operated several downstream valves for years. The original entrance branch fed one controller when his company took the contract. Later boards added 2 median zones. The clubhouse pond autofill had been connected during a landscaping renovation 5 years earlier. Who approved those additions? I asked. Vic tapped the work order against his leg. Different boards. We receive a scope, we price a scope. That was not an answer to authorization, but it was an answer to how the system had grown without a single dramatic conspiracy. One small work order at a time can build an impressive mistake. Vic walked to the barrier but did not cross it. He examined the wet lining and the brass seal. If I cut that lock, am I buying a concrete flume? Possibly an orchard too, depending on how generous you feel. He put the valve key back in the truck. I photographed the work order with his permission and asked him to email the dates of the zone additions. He agreed, after I told him Ravi was reviewing the branch. Vic did not change sides. He changed from a contractor with instructions to a contractor who wanted the instructions documented. Marla arrived 10 minutes later and accused him of refusing an authorized emergency repair. I maintain your side, Vic said. I don't open sealed ditch controls on somebody else's ranch. She called Lena's office. Lena returned long enough to add the work order and attempted intervention to the incident file. She did not threaten arrests. She reminded Marla that the operator had ordered the control preserved. Then Ravi arrived. He checked the lining, photographed the seal, and inspected the old branch box. The branch did not have a current ditch company meter tag. Ravi pulled up the annual service register on his tablet and searched Sage Meadow, the developer's old company name, and the parcel number. Nothing current appeared. "That doesn't prove there was never a later agreement," he said. "It proves I don't have an active service entry tied to this connection." Marla asked him to reopen the water while everyone searched. Ravi shook his head. "Not with a curing repair, no current meter tag, and a disputed branch map." He placed a formal operating hold on the restart. "Once the lining cured, we would isolate my orchard turnouts and conduct a controlled test." Before that happened, both sides had to produce every agreement, map, invoice, and work order connected to the branch. The repair was no longer just repairing a crack. We were about to measure an assumption. My father kept ranch records in metal filing cabinets that had survived 2 office remodels, 1 roof leak, and every promise I ever made to organize them. The drawers were labeled by subject, though his subjects included categories such as important, old important, and do not throw away. The developer file was in the 3rd category. Inside was a folded map dated 19 years earlier. A red line marked a temporary branch from our lateral to the first Sage Meadow construction phase. The note beside it referenced dust suppression, initial plant establishment, and a maximum draw of 12 gallons per minute. Another page assigned the temporary meter, branch maintenance, and removal or conversion costs to the developer. The allowance expired 18 months after the final certificate of occupancy for Phase 1, unless the developer obtained a separate seasonal service agreement. I called Ravi. "That matches the archive index," he said. "Come to the office." The ditch company archive contained the signed allowance, meter installation sheet, 3 months of construction readings, and a final inspection note. The temporary meter had been removed after the developer stopped submitting readings. There was no conversion application attached. Ravi checked annual registers under every variation of the developer and HOA names. No current service account appeared. That mattered, but he kept the conclusion narrow. "The register tells us the company is not administering an active delivery through that branch," he said. "It does not tell us what pipes are open downstream or what private arrangement somebody may claim." I appreciated the distinction. Marla did not. She attended the document review with Nora and the HOA attorney, a careful man named Seth Coleman who spent most of the meeting reducing Marla's sentences to questions he could safely ask. Marla pointed to the original map. "This proves Sage Meadow was granted water. For construction," Nora said. "It proves a relationship. It proves an expiration date," Seth said. Marla argued that the right must have transferred when the developer handed common areas to the HOA. Seth asked for the transfer schedule. The schedule listed monuments, medians, private roads, lights, and the clubhouse parcel. It did not list a water service agreement. I could have acted triumphant. I did not feel triumphant. I felt embarrassed that I had assumed the branch was dead or regularized without checking. My career had been built around telling landowners not to confuse visible hardware with current authority, and I had managed to do exactly that from the comfortable side of my own fence. I said so. That admission changed the room. Nora stopped treating the meeting as a contest between 2 perfect versions of events. Vic's later work orders made more sense too. The branch had not been hidden. It had simply outlived the file that explained it. Marla seized on my uncertainty. "Then you cannot prove we were not approved later." "Not yet," I said. The record answered why the connection existed. It did not answer what the HOA had connected to it now. Vic had described multiple additions, but we needed a current physical map and measured flow. Ravi proposed a supervised tracer test after the lining reached its cure time. We would isolate my orchard branches, install a temporary calibrated meter, open HOA zones one at a time, and observe where the tracer appeared. Everyone could watch. Everyone would sign the test plan. Marla asked whether the test was necessary when the HOA's use was already established. Ravi looked at the blank service register. What is established is that everybody has been very confident. It was the closest Ravi came to sarcasm, and because he used it once every 3 years, it landed with the force of an engineering report. The test was scheduled for Friday morning. Seth requested one more archive search through the county development file. That produced the original subdivision utility narrative. It listed potable water, sewer, power, and the proposed future town irrigation point. The ranch branch appeared only in a construction note, cross-reference to the temporary allowance. There was no dedication language, no permanent easement description, and no schedule transferring the allowance to the HOA. Marla asked whether the missing permanent document could simply have been lost. Seth said it was possible in the broad sense that almost anything was possible. Then he explained the narrower problem. A board could not enforce a right against someone else merely by proposing that the document proving it might once have existed. If a later agreement surfaced, they would review it. Until then, they had an expired allowance, a blank register, and a physical branch of unknown scope. That distinction also protected the story from becoming too easy. We did not suddenly know the whole truth because one folder opened. We knew the developer had permission once. We knew that permission ended on paper. We still had to establish what had happened in the ground since then, and whether current use matched any plausible continuation of the original arrangement. Before then, Nora found the first invoice. Sage Meadows' landscaping contract included a monthly line labeled Municipal Irrigation Supply and System Management. The amount varied by season. Nora had approved those invoices for 4 years because the wording looked ordinary and the totals fit the budget. She called the town utility office and asked for the HOA's irrigation account number. There was no account. The homes had individual potable accounts. The clubhouse had a domestic account. The town had designed an approved irrigation connection near the south entrance, but Sage Meadow had never paid to install it. Nora sent the invoices to Seth and requested an emergency records session. Vic joined by video. He explained that his company billed for operating the irrigation system, controller programming, seasonal startup, and water management. The phrase municipal irrigation supply had been copied from the prior contractor's template. Did your company purchase water from the town? Nora asked. No. Did you pay the ditch company? No. Then what did supply mean? Vic paused. It appears to have meant the line fit on the invoice. That answer was not flattering, but it was more believable than a secret theft scheme. Nobody had created a master plan to steal ranch water. A developer left a temporary branch. A board assumed it transferred. A contractor inherited a controller. Another board added a median. An invoice copied an old label. Each person handled the piece in front of them, and the entire system acquired legitimacy through repetition. Bureaucracy rarely needs a villain when it has a template. Nora reviewed meeting minutes. 5 years earlier, the board approved connecting the clubhouse pond autofill to existing community irrigation. 3 years later, it added the east median. The minutes discussed landscaping costs but never identified a water provider, meter, flow limit, or renewal date. Residents reacted in predictable groups. Some insisted the ranch should continue supplying water because stopping it would be unfair. Others wanted to know why dues had funded something described as municipal service when no municipal service existed. A third group wanted the grass painted green until the argument ended, which was the first proposal that accurately matched the board's relationship with appearances. Marla asked me privately whether I would reopen the branch if the HOA paid a temporary fee directly to me. I declined. I was not refusing a reasonable solution. I was refusing to create another undocumented solution, while everyone was standing inside the consequences of the first one. Any temporary service needed a measured amount, operator approval, maintenance terms, and a safe configuration. The heat wave remained real. The HOA could reduce damage with tanker watering for vulnerable trees and suspend ornamental pond filling. Ravi helped Vic identify those temporary steps. Protecting plants did not require pretending the old branch was authorized. By Thursday evening, the flume lining had cured. Eli and I tested the repaired section at low flow on the ranch side, then drained it for Friday's controlled test. Our orchard rotation was delayed, but still possible that night if the test ended on time. The original allowance told us what had once been permitted. The invoices told us what nobody had bothered to verify. The next morning, the water would tell us what was actually connected. Nora's review also exposed how ordinary the problem had looked from inside the board. Monthly packets showed landscaping totals, variance notes, and controller repairs. A director could review every page and never see an obvious theft because the documents did not say free ranch water. They said system management. Each year, the new budget copied the old category. Each new board inherited a number that arrived wearing the respectability of last year's approval. That did not excuse Marla's 911 call or the fines. It did explain why other directors had not challenged the source earlier. Institutions often hide their weakest assumption inside their most familiar expense. Nora drafted a notice to residents separating confirmed facts from unresolved ones. Potable water remained normal. The ranch repair was authorized. The HOA irrigation branch lacked a located current service agreement. A controlled test would determine present connections. She refused Marla's suggested sentence that the board was defending long-standing community rights, because, as Nora wrote in the margin, identifying the rights was the purpose of the review. For the first time, the official communication sounded less certain than the facts. That was progress. Ravi arrived before sunrise with a portable meter, sampling bottles, numbered seals, and a test plan written clearly enough that even an emergency HOA meeting could not improve it. We identified 6 observation points: the original entrance median, west median, east median, clubhouse pond autofill, ranch orchard turnout, and hayfield turnout. My 2 turnouts would remain closed and sealed. Vic would activate HOA controller zones in a fixed order. Nora would record times. Seth and Lena would observe. Lena was there because the prior incident involved an attempted intervention, not because fluorescent dye required law enforcement. The tracer was an approved visible dye used at a low test concentration in raw irrigation systems. Ravi explained that it was not entering household water because the potable network was separate. He repeated that point for the residents watching from outside the work area. Marla signed the observation plan last. "I still object to the premise," she said. "Your signature says you observe the procedure," Ravi replied. "It does not require you to enjoy it." Vic confirmed all HOA zones were closed. I showed 0 flow at the temporary meter. Ravi inspected the repaired lining and authorized a limited test release. The dye went into the upstream test tank. Before opening the gate, Ravi asked each side to state its expectation. I expected the original entrance median to show tracer. Based on Vic's work orders, I expected at least 2 later zones. I did not know the volume. Marla said only the original entrance landscaping might be physically connected. She insisted the clubhouse pond was served by an independent recycled water line installed during renovation. Vic looked down at his controller list but said nothing. That claim made the test useful. It could be proven or disproven in minutes without anyone explaining their intentions. Ravi opened the headgate to a controlled setting. The temporary meter began recording. Water entered the repaired flume, passed the isolated orchard turnouts, and reached the developer branch. For the first 2 minutes, nothing happened downstream. Then Vic opened Zone 1. We had agreed on what would count as a valid observation. Color had to appear at a labeled point after the corresponding controller opened and within the calculated travel window. Ravi took a baseline sample at every point before the release. Nora photographed each sample bottle beside a timestamp card. If a zone showed no tracer, it would be recorded as no observed connection, rather than treated as proof of some clever concealment. Those details slowed the morning, which was the point. Marla had spent 2 days insisting the situation was obvious. A credible test is designed for the possibility that the person running it is wrong. Eli watched our sealed orchard turnouts while I monitored the temporary meter. Vic stood at the HOA controller with Seth. No one person controlled both the source and the observations. Ravi had also set a maximum test flow below the repaired flume's operating limit. If pressure changed unexpectedly, he would stop the run. The procedure lacked the dramatic efficiency of television. It had sample labels, waiting periods, and 3 adults checking the same number. It also meant that when the first green water appeared, nobody could honestly claim we had improvised the conclusion. The entrance sprinklers rose together. At first, they released clear residual water. 30 seconds later, a pale green tint appeared in the spray, and deepened enough to show against the dry grass. Nora recorded the time. Ravi recorded the flow. The original allowance capped delivery at 12 gallons per minute. Zone 1 alone drew just under 10. Vic closed it and opened the west median. The meter climbed to 14 before Ravi adjusted the control to protect the test setup. Green water emerged from a row of drip emitters beneath ornamental grasses planted years after Phase 1. Marla said the median might still fall within the original landscape plan. Ravi asked for the plan. Seth quietly placed the old map beside her. The west median did not exist on it. Zone 3 served the east entrance. Its sprinklers showed tracer after a longer delay. The draw rose again. That branch had been added under a board work order 3 years earlier. Each result answered one question and removed one excuse. The physical network had expanded. The measured demand exceeded the temporary cap. The additions had occurred through documented HOA work orders, not a mysterious nighttime trench. Then we reached the clubhouse pond. Marla repeated that it used recycled water. Vic opened the controller output labeled Pond Makeup. For nearly a minute, the autofill chamber remained clear. Marla folded her arms. I began to wonder whether that part of the system had been separated after all. Then, a thin green ribbon entered through the lower pipe. It spread slowly across the chamber, curled around the float valve, and turned the water unmistakably bright. No one gasped. Real meetings rarely provide synchronized reactions. Nora stopped writing for 2 seconds, then underlined the time. Vic checked the valve label. That's the line we tied in during the pond renovation. Marla looked at him. You told us it was recycled. The proposal said reuse existing irrigation supply. I didn't design a recycled system. The distinction was brutal in its ordinariness. A phrase had been read as technology. The pipe had never agreed. Ravi closed the test flow and totaled the readings. With all landscaping zones scheduled normally, projected peak demand substantially exceeded the old allowance. The branch lacked a current meter tag and the backflow configuration required for a modern seasonal service. The clubhouse connection was not listed on the developer map. None of that meant the HOA owned the water because it reached HOA property. Marla tried that argument anyway. The test proves the system is ours. Ravi shook his head. It proves your system depends on this branch. Physical connection is not operating authorization. That sentence did more work than any threat could have done. The test established present reality. The archive established the old permission. The service register established that no current delivery was being administered. The invoices established that residents had been charged under language implying a provider account that did not exist. One fact would have produced another argument. Together, they produced a decision. Ravi issued written conditions for any restart: a lawful seasonal service agreement or an approved alternate connection, dedicated metering, backflow protection, defined flow limit, maintenance responsibility, and payment for documented test and system costs. The ranch repair could return to operation. My orchard turnouts were no longer part of the investigation, but the HOA branch remained closed. Marla asked whether that meant the entrance could die while paperwork moved. Ravi said the ditch company could review an emergency temporary agreement within days if the HOA accepted measurement, upgrades, and cost responsibility. Tanker watering could protect critical plantings in the meantime. The pond would remain off because ornamental water was not an emergency, regardless of how tastefully the stones had been arranged. Residents began asking Nora about the invoices and the cost of a lawful connection. The conflict had changed. They were no longer asking why I had turned off their water. They were asking why their HOA had never arranged to have any. The member meeting took place 4 days later in the clubhouse room overlooking the half-empty pond. The board had placed bottled water at every chair, an unintentionally elaborate reminder that nobody's drinking supply had ever been threatened. Nora presented the timeline. She did not accuse anyone of stealing. She displayed the temporary allowance, expiration, blank service history, work orders, invoices, and test results. The strength of the presentation came from refusing to make it stronger than the evidence. Ravi described 2 options. The first was a metered seasonal agreement through the ranch lateral. It required a dedicated meter, backflow protection, a maximum flow schedule compatible with my orchard rotation, maintenance terms, and annual renewal. It was faster and less expensive initially, but it kept the HOA dependent on a shared agricultural delivery schedule. The second was the town's approved irrigation connection at the south entrance. It cost more to construct but gave Sage Meadow independent service subject to town rates and restrictions. Neither option was free. That caused more outrage than the 911 call had. Marla argued that prior boards had relied on the existing arrangement in good faith. Nora agreed, then pointed out that good faith did not install a meter or pay a provider. Seth recommended rescinding every notice and fine sent to me, correcting the resident message, and negotiating temporary seasonal service while the HOA obtained engineering bids for independence. I requested reimbursement for specific costs: Ravi's test fee, additional lining crew standby time caused by the attempted intervention, temporary meter setup, and documented excess maintenance attributable to the expanded draw once the engineer calculated it. I did not demand the value of every gallon used over 19 years. We did not have measurements for that, and Fiction was already doing enough work in the HOA's budget. Several residents asked why they should pay for a board mistake. Nora answered that they were paying for an infrastructure problem belonging to the association, whether they liked its origin or not. She proposed a modest special assessment for temporary upgrades and a reserve study for the town connection. Marla apologized for describing me as a saboteur before verifying the account. The apology was careful and public. It did not transform her personality. It did change the official record. The board voted to rescind the fines, issue the correction, authorize the seasonal agreement, fund the meter and backflow work, and audit the landscaping contract. Marla abstained on the final vote. Nora voted yes. No one applauded. People studied the assessment estimate, asked about tree watering, and argued over whether the pond needed to refill at all. That was more realistic and, in its way, more satisfying. The HOA had moved from pretending the water was free to debating what lawful water was worth. The agreement gave Sage Meadow a limited morning window outside my orchard turns. It made the HOA responsible for downstream maintenance and required annual renewal. It also stated, in language no future committee could decorate, that continued physical connection did not create ownership of the ranch lateral. The system would reopen after the new hardware passed inspection. This time, the permission would arrive before the water. The temporary agreement took 3 days to negotiate because each practical detail exposed another assumption. Sage Meadow wanted enough morning flow to run several zones together. Ravi would approve only a staggered schedule within the lateral's available capacity. I needed the orchard rotation protected during peak demand. Vic needed access to downstream valves without access to my head gate. The insurer required the backflow assembly to be inspected and the control responsibilities written plainly. We eventually settled on 2 HOA delivery windows, automatic shutoff at the dedicated meter, and a contact chain for maintenance closures. If my ranch needed emergency work, I had to notify the HOA contact. If Sage Meadow changed a zone, it had to submit the revised demand before connecting it. Those terms sounded obvious after the dispute. Most useful terms do. The special assessment was not enormous, but it was visible enough to make residents ask better questions. Nora published the meter estimate, backflow cost, test charges, tanker watering, and engineering study as separate lines. She also showed which expenses came from immediate compliance and which belonged to the future independent connection. Marla wanted the assessment notice to describe the costs as an unforeseen regional water transition. Nora changed it to correction of undocumented irrigation service. The first phrase sounded like weather. The second sounded like governance. Members deserved the second one. Eli and I restarted the orchard turnouts Friday night. The repaired flume held, pressure stabilized, the seep stayed dry, and the young trees received their full rotation before the hottest afternoon of the week. Sage Meadow used tanker water on its most vulnerable plantings for 6 days. The entrance lawn browned at the edges but recovered. The clubhouse pond lost several inches and discovered, without lasting injury, that it was ornamental. The new branch meter was installed the following week. Backflow protection and labeled isolation valves followed. Ravi inspected the work, Vic updated the controller schedule, and Nora replaced the landscaping invoice language with separate lines for system operation and actual water service charges. The HOA reimbursed the documented repair delay and test costs. The amount was meaningful but not cinematic. Nobody sold a clubhouse, lost a mansion, or received a federal sentence for overwatering a median. Nora also created a utility authorization register. For every shared service, it listed the provider, physical source, purpose, account number, volume or capacity limit, maintenance responsibility, renewal date, and board contact. It was not an exciting document. That was precisely why it was useful. Exciting utility documents usually mean someone ignored the boring ones. Marla stepped away from the infrastructure committee. She remained HOA president through the end of her term, but Nora handled the seasonal agreement and the town connection study. Some residents continued to believe I should have reopened the gate immediately. Others sent brief apologies, most simply adjusted to a line item they had never known was missing. By autumn, the HOA had chosen to build the independent town connection the following spring. The seasonal agreement would bridge one more irrigation cycle, then the old developer branch would be capped and recorded as inactive. On the last morning of the season, I walked down to the head gate with Eli. The new meter showed exactly how much water had passed to Sage Meadow during its approved window. The seal was intact. The orchard schedule had not been disturbed. For years, everyone had looked at the same pipe and seen whatever was convenient: a leftover construction line, a community entitlement, a contractor's existing system, a budget label, somebody else's responsibility. Now it had a meter, a limit, an agreement, and an expiration date. I had turned off my own water on my own ranch. The HOA called 911 because its lawns went dry. But the real problem was never that I closed a gate. It was that nobody on the other side had bothered to name what they expected to come through it. Water follows a channel. Responsibility should too.